Oh yeah, I just want to say thanks for sitting down with us.
My pleasure.
Could you kind of first start by telling us your name and what you do?
So my name is Rabbi Shlomo Levertov, and I run a Chabad center in Paradise Valley, and I deal a lot with the young professional communities, the 20s and 30s.
Mm-hmm. So one thing I was really curious about is, what is the importance of Israel in the Jewish faith?
So the importance of Israel runs deep in our blood. And it's actually, before I get to the importance, it's interesting when you actually visit Israel or you go to Israel, there's like a sense of belonging and feeling and connection. And so Israel has an important part in our history, not only like in the actual practice of what we do, which there are laws for that and stuff like that, but Israel itself is it's just a part and parcel of the Jewish people. It's throughout, in our prayers, we pray 3 times a day. In our prayers, there's 20 mentions in a day of returning to Israel, coming to Israel, the Holy Land, the people of the land. And throughout our history, what kept us actually strong was always that knowing that we have a sense of belonging, we have a place, even when it wasn't under Jewish rule or anything, we always had a place that was our home. That was our hope, was to always get there and get back there and be there.
Mm-hmm. But going back to the very beginning, to the Torah, what is the connection to Israel?
So the first verse of the Torah speaks about the creation of the world, and the most famous commentary in the Torah, his name is Rashi, and he right away says over there, he says that this actually, the reason why the Torah starts off with creation is because the Torah is not a history book, and it could start off with maybe the Jewish people. Why does it start with creation? He says that God said, I created the world, and I decided that I want to give the land of Israel to the Jewish people. And that's why the Torah starts like that. And so it was God's presence to the Jewish people. And it has major significance on a practical level. Well, actually, we can go spiritual and practical at the same time. But spiritual level was just it's literally a holy land. It's something holy, something special. It's not about physical. You could dig for today to tomorrow. You're not going to find it. It's something. God put a spiritual holiness to it, and there's something special. He blessed the land, and He gave that to the Jewish people as a part of the chosen nation to be able to do our job as Jews, which is to be a moral light to the nations, to the world. And from a historical perspective, Israel's there's 7 or 8 ports in Israel. So in the ancient times, this is before social media, you basically, if you wanted to connect to the entire world, Israel was the best place. You were smack dab. You had ships coming from this side, ships going from this side. You were importing, exporting. It was a hub of the world. And so if the Jewish people had a job to be a moral compass, and people say Judeo values. So if we have a job of kind of bringing that to the world, it was a perfect spot to be able to do that.
And when did the Jewish people first arrive in Israel?
So Moses, Abraham was in Israel, Isaac was in Israel, Jacob's famous dream of the ladder, when God promised that he'll continue Abraham's promise to Jacob and Jacob's children, that happened in Israel. So the Jewish people were in Israel from Abraham's time.
So who was Abraham?
Abraham was the first person who recognized that the world had a God and a creator. Mm-hmm. And God came to him in a vision and told him that he's going to, follow my ways. He sent him out of his, left his family home, which was full of idol worship, and brought him to Israel.
So everybody before Abraham was like a pagan, basically.
No, it wasn't. There's stories of Noah, Adam. There were always righteous people from the beginning of creation. There were always righteous people who recognized. You have to understand, Adam was formed by God, so he knew that God created him, and he literally watched God create his wife. In other words, Eve just came from nothing. So that was a pretty strong understanding that there's a God in the world. And then as time goes on, you have to educate your children. And then eventually a couple generations later, I think it was 10 generations later, confusion started, and the idea of idol worship started. And people want to create their own God, create how God should look and what they feel God should believe. And so that started. But all throughout history, there's always been believers.
So Abraham was like the proto Jesus. Because Islam, Judaism, and Christianity are all defined as Abrahamic religions. So he's like the OG of monotheism at the top of the food chain.
So he definitely is in that way. I would say that if you want to go into religion, every religion has to start with a revelation. Mm-hmm. And so for Christianity, it would be Jesus, and for Arabs, it would probably be Muhammad. And for the Jewish people, it was actually a revelation at Mount Sinai. So there's not one person in Judaism who had that revelation. History tells us that the Jewish people, there was over 1 million people that had a revelation at the same time, mm-hmm. and that was on our way to Israel, actually.
Now, what's the significance of this land to Arabs?
I'm a rabbi. I don't know. I mean, if you, I feel like it's not a, it's not my job to teach. But I would say is that I believe Muhammad was in the year 500 BC, CE, and it's 500 after Common Era, and the temple was built maybe 500 BCE. In other words, so we're talking about Temple Mount, and it was 1,000 years before before Islam or anything like that. So I feel like it's not my territory to discuss that.
No, for sure. I just, it's interesting because a lot of people look at it as kind of like an ancient religious clash, but Judaism is far older than Islam or Christianity, right?
Much older. I mean, our temples were built way before that. Like King Solomon, forget about Moses and bringing the Jewish, Joshua bringing the Jewish people into the land of Israel. There's archaeology that you can actually find. So when I was in Israel, we went to a city called Shiloh. Mm-hmm. And one of the amazing things is that literally when it rains in the city of Shiloh, you can literally pick up from the floor shards of pottery that was used in the temple. It was like you literally pick up a piece of history. So maybe that also connects to like why is Israel so important to Jews? Literally, like you're walking on the floor, on the ground. You can pick up things that were held by our ancestors. Like we're talking about over 1,000 years. At this over 2,500 years ago. So like that's pretty impressive, pretty connected.
So what was the kingdom of Israel?
So after the Jews came into Israel, shortly after they started the Davidic dynasty, and King David was King David had control over King Saul, then King David. King David had control over Israel, and then King David's son, King Solomon, built the temples. Mm-hmm. And so that was they are finding recently and still now they're finding things from King David's time period, and literally his right hand man's stamp, like his seal of approval, where he would seal. I think they found that seal. Mm-hmm. So like.
And then I was told by a scholar that the Romans kicked the Jews out of Israel in the first century BC.
Yeah, so it's important to note that there was never a time period that the Jews were kicked out of Israel completely. In other words, even when the Jews had exiles and we did leave Israel, there were always Jews who stayed in Israel. So even when when a big part of Judaism moved to Babylonia, Iraq, Iran, and that's where a big part of our Talmud, which are some of Jewish law, and was written and put together. The Jews were still living in Israel. A lot of times they were communicating back and forth. You'll study the Talmud of the Babylonian Talmud. It'll be like, and we got a message from Israel that a rabbi came from Israel and confirmed or said this is different. They're learning it differently in Israel. So there was never a time period that actually Jews were not in Israel. Even. I mean, you read the news and they want to make it sound like the Jews came, after the Holocaust or whatever. Like there were Jews living in Israel during the Holocaust, before the Holocaust. I'm a Chabad rabbi, so the first Chabad Rebbe, which would be like the mentor of the Chabad movement, was literally sending charity to Jewish communities in Israel in 1788. And in his book called the Tanya, which is an amazing book on mysticism, he literally requests that people send charity to the Jews of Israel. So we're talking about like. This is pre-UN resolutions, pre-everything.
Right.
So I do want to mention one thing. Sorry, before we continue, I just want to mention one thing is that it's a little weird to sit down and talk about the history of Israel in the middle of a war. In the sense, like what I would think the real focus is not about the history. No one sits in the middle of a war and be like, oh my gosh, let's look at the history books. Like, should we give them the land or not? Like, let's see what history says. No, it's like when barbarians come and literally slaughter Jewish children, Jewish mothers, Jewish fathers, Jewish grandparents, and literally just slaughter them. It's not a time to like look at the history, who's right, who's wrong. And I'm happy to, as a job of a rabbi, I'm always happy to teach and to explore. But the general idea is like that's not the discussion now. The discussion now isn't the history and who. I don't even let's say for whatever reason they had a claim or had something or whatever it is. That doesn't ever allow for the for what happened on Saturday or Sunday, or what's happening throughout the past 50 years or 70 years in Israel of rockets. Sometimes there's rockets every couple days or something, or so that doesn't. So it's it's good to talk history, but that's not in the middle of a war. It's like no one goes be like, oh, should we give back Arizona to the Indians or to them let's look at the history. It doesn't. So I'm just giving like that little intro. No,
for sure. So how do you feel about what's going on right now in Israel?
how do I feel? I just when I have pressure or something like that, like my shoulders like kind of like feel heavy and buckle, and literally for the past week and a half, like my shoulders are like, I literally feel so tense. It's our brothers and sisters in Israel. I have blood relatives there, but even forget the blood relatives. There are brothers and sisters, and if I would go there, they would open their doors with open arms to me as a family member. And what they experience, forget about the shock of the entire country. What the people actually experience is something that no one should experience. I have children that age, and I go through these things in my head, like what would happen if it happened right here? Like what would be my first thing? Where would I go? Where would I take my family? Mm-hmm. Where would I put them? What would I do? And it's like it's crazy. Not even as a Jew, as a human being, it's crazy to think that someone can do that. Mm-hmm. And they didn't care that when they came into those homes, they didn't care who was there, who was not there, who was Jewish, who wasn't Jewish. In fact, there were many non-Jews who were killed also. But the point is like that's something that humanity as a whole should be nervous and scared. It's something that we wouldn't want to see that at any time to happen to anyone. We wouldn't wish that on our worst enemies. What happened on Saturday, we wouldn't wish on our worst enemies. Mm-hmm. It's like, so it's crazy to think that there actually could be supporters who are actually marching and for them and for those people and whatever. It's something that we wouldn't wish on our, as a Jew specifically, I think as a human being, we wouldn't wish what happened in Israel on October 7th on our own enemies. I
guess the justification for the pro-Palestine protesters is that the blockade on Gaza is inhumane and it should be lifted.
So first of all, I think that's just an excuse. That's just an excuse, and I mean, we could talk about that. But besides for that, is that most of that is just an excuse on the. You go to any of those rallies, and that's not what they're asking. They're not just asking for humanitarian aid. And most of the people who are at those rallies are people who actually believe in the destruction of every Jewish person. And most of them, I heard from someone say, it's not that they don't want us to have the land of Israel. They don't want us to have any land. They want us in the ocean. And the real truth is that for an American, they don't care about Americans either. So it's not even, people's like, oh, we'll march with them, we'll parade with them. And I would say that most of the people who are parading with them, they wouldn't last a day in Gaza. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't last a day in Gaza. In fact, the Jewish people, we've lived amongst Arab nations for hundreds of years. There were huge Jewish communities in Iraq, in Syria, in Iran, huge. How many Jews are left in those countries? Some of them, maybe one. Mm-hmm. Some of them, maybe not, most likely none.
Why is that?
Why is that? Because they don't want us, not in Israel, not anywhere. In other words, as soon as time came it became hostile, and the Jewish people picked up and left. They didn't wait for the UN to make humanitarian resolutions, or some of them literally left millions of dollars. They had huge businesses. They literally just left it because once you have once you have this type of hostility coming to you, so you just pick up and leave. And I think I can't say this. Maybe this is on the record, but off the record is that I feel like any person who lives in Gaza and feels that Hamas is a terrorist organization, instead of crying now and asking for humanitarian aid, I feel like they should have used their time. I'm not saying this they should have used their time to actually leave. In the past 10 years, in the past 20 years. And now, going forward, they should figure out a time to leave, to immigrate, to leave, to figure, in others, it should be a priority. If you're not, it's maybe because you, maybe you do agree with what Hamas is doing and what's happening. So I leave the morals and ethics to the morals and ethics committee of the IDF. That's not my job. Mm-hmm. But I feel like anybody who's marching and saying it's only because of humanitarian or whatever, did they march also on Sunday and Monday? Did they march to say, "Oh my gosh, that was barbaric. That's not humane"? Mm-hmm. Are they marching today for the 200 plus hostages that are stuck in Gaza? Are they marching for them? So it's like all of a sudden, humanitarian aid that Hamas should take and just use it as more gas and more. Are they? I want to see, before you march for the humanitarian aid for the Gazans, I want to see you march for those 200 hostages who knows what's happening? Who knows if they're even alive now? Who knows what's happening? So I want you to march for those. Let's get those 200, and then let's talk about the people holding those 200.
Mm-hmm. Was Palestine ever a country?
Not in my history books. I don't. It was never. I mean, Israel didn't get Israel from Palestine. It got Israel from the Ottoman, from the British. It didn't. It was a UN resolution, and in fact, the Arabs were also offered a country at that time, and they said no. which no one, I mean, they're not going to march about that, but.
And that was the proposed two-state solution in '67?
Or even earlier, even in 1948, when Israel got the part of Israel that they got, the Arabs were also given a portion. They said no.
Why do you think they said no?
I think it's obvious. Because they didn't want to accept that. They didn't want to accept the sovereignty of Israel. So they figured if they're not a country, then they can create. They were hoping to be able to wipe Israel off the map. So they figured that they can continue fighting until they can wipe Israel off the map.
What do you think's going through the psychology of some of these Hamas insurgents? How can someone do something like that?
So I think that part of the problem that Americans have now is that we judge people based on ourselves. And we're like, oh, if I was in that situation, this is how I would feel, and this is how I would react, and this is how I would want people to react to me with compassion or whatever it is. But most likely, they don't think the same way we think. And so it's like, I have no clue. I have no clue what's going on in their mind. I couldn't imagine. I couldn't imagine a human being who could do that. On my worst day, or even on an American criminal's worst day, I couldn't imagine that. I couldn't imagine that happening. And so, you want to know what's going on in their minds? I have no clue. I have no clue. And I think that that's part of what America gets wrong, is that they think that these are regular people, and they're just crying out of poverty or out of oppression or whatever it is. But number one is that they don't think the same way we think, so you can't use that as a measuring stick. But number two is, I also want to say is that when you asked about Jews in other countries, when we were in those countries, what we did is we got out of there. And you know what happened when we came to America or other countries that welcomed us in? We continued building life. And if you look in California, the Jewish community in California is primarily an Iranian Jewish community. They literally were left Iran. They left their entire household. They left everything. And some of those Iranians are successful doctors, lawyers, everything. In other words, they left everything and they created a life instead of leaving everything and now just crying oppression and crying this and crying that. And we had nothing. Many of those Jews who left Iran, they left with a shoestring on their back and created huge companies, huge businesses, employed other people, helped other people, and literally are giving back to humanity instead of crying. In general, that's the Jewish story is to not focus on all the negativity, but always to build and always to continue. Oppression doesn't lead to barbarism like this. In fact, if you were oppressed, then maybe you would actually feel for other people. And it came out yesterday or the day before was like full packets that some of these Hamas soldiers had on them of the plan of the war. And literally, like it's worked out like it wasn't just oppressed people who just couldn't handle it anymore and just went out. It was planned since October 2022. Literally page after page, who's going to do what, and it clearly says kill civilians, who was in charge of taking hostages, who was in charge of killing, who was in charge of that. It's literally laid out on papers. And, obviously the world's going to say that Israel made it up, but they'll say that no matter what. But it was literally the inhumane things that they were planning on doing and that they actually did is literally laid out on paper. So that's. One other thing on the same note is, I'm not here to just share what we read on social media, but like, if you're talking about people being oppressed, so Israel has, actually like in America, we also have the same thing on the borders, that you can get like work passes that you can come over the border during the day, work, and then go back. And so some of the terrorists who actually came in on October 7th were actually people who had work passes. In other words, they weren't oppressed. They were people who had jobs. They had jobs in Israel. They were working at the supermarkets in Israel. They were working at the gas stations. They were working whatever jobs it was in Israel. Maybe they were even working for a manufacturing company. They were literally working, and they were the same ones who came and attacked. So it's not just about oppression and oppressed people. They were people who had jobs. Israel gave them jobs, and then they came back and they helped actually plan the attack.
Yeah, it's pretty horrible, man. So what can you tell us about the Second Intifada and the effect that it had on Israeli society?
So I don't know, like all the different wars of Israel.
In 2000, that led to the closure of the borders in 2005. What happened in those years in terms of civilian bombings in Jerusalem and stuff?
I'm saying I don't know like about the different time periods of Israel. What happened and what's happening in the kind of outlook of Israel and stuff like that. But the general idea is that Israel lives under the people of Israel live under constant attacks, constant fear to a certain degree. Wherever you are, you're basically watching your back, and just it's not a way to live, and it's not like people are like, oh, I just wish we can go back to the way it was on October 6th. And the reality is that October 6th, there were people who were still living under terror, and that's not the way it's supposed to be. It shouldn't be. It became so normal in Israel. It's like, oh, terrorist attack, bombing of a pizza shop, no big deal, bus bombing, and it became so normal. It's like, oh, Israel has from time to time bombings. It's like, but the reality is that that's not normal, and it shouldn't be like that. And they weren't, they're not sending stuff at like, IDF posts or like literally a pizza shop. It wasn't frequented, whatever. In other words, in that aspect is like, I believe that, it's not time to go back to the way it was October 6th. It's time to make sure that we get rid of terrorism, like America believes when something's happening on our soil, like every other country, like every person would want for their own house, for their own family.
What do you think is the solution to this?
It's way above my pay grade, but I do want to say one thing is that Israel never just kicked out. There are Arabs who live in Israel, and the reality is that Arabs were allowed to live in Israel. They could live in Israel. The only Arabs that were kicked out are Arabs who fought back, who fought Israel's government and weakened the security of Israel. But in reality, Jews and Israel as a whole doesn't have a problem with the Arabs. They don't have a problem with Arabs living in Israel, right? So it's kind of like if you talk to other they want the Jews out, but Jews lived even when there was like more stronger Arab population in Israel. Jews lived there, right? Jews lived under Iran. Jews lived in Iran. Jews lived in Iraq. So Israel doesn't have a problem with Arab people living in Israel. Mm-hmm. So it's more about safety and security and making sure that that the people of Israel are safe, including the Arabs who live in Israel, making sure that they're safe as well.
Mm-hmm. Now, is there a part of you that feels bad for like civilians and stuff in Gaza who are just getting caught in the crossfire?
So I definitely could find compassion for anybody who's falling in the crossfire. I'm not sure how to identify who's falling in the crossfire. In other words, I don't know to say that all the people living in Gaza are falling in the crossfire. I don't know who is part of the problem. I don't know. I try not to let in my head, I try not to let my mind go there in the sense that, right, I feel like Israel has a morals and ethics committee and they're taking care of that, or whatever it is. It's not my job. But the reality is that there were like thousands of people stormed through the border. It's hard to think that that there weren't tons of civilians who actually knew that this was happening. So if they knew that this was going to happen, then are they caught in the crossfire, or are they part of the problem? As if I knew that my neighbor was going to do this to your house, I would have got on the phone. If I don't get on the phone, then maybe I'm part of the problem too, right? So I don't know how to identify. They say 80% of Gaza is pro-Hamas. So is that 80%? Are they just caught in the crossfire, or they're part of the problem? Mm-hmm. I don't know. So I don't, when the Jews left Egypt, it says that one of the things, what it says it was a 40 journeys that the Jews took out of Egypt. And so like the obvious question is like, no, they just took one journey. Like you step over the border, you're out of Egypt, right? Mm-hmm. When the Jews left Egypt in biblical times. Why was it a 40-year journey? So the idea is that it was a 40-year journey to literally enter the promised land. In other words, to be able to kind of take away that victimhood. If you look at the stories in the Bible, in the beginning is like, something went wrong. It's like, take us back to Egypt. It was better there. Something else went wrong. It was like, we could have done better in Egypt. They were still kind of looking back at Egypt as that was, that was something that they were. And then as they got closer to the land of Israel, it was like, okay, they were ready to start fresh. And I think that's one of the messages that Jews have for the world. If you want to learn the lesson, I mean, you can take it and be jealous, but if you want to learn the lesson, is to stand up and continue on and move on and continue to build. For sure. So one of the kind of flash words on social media being used a lot is the word Zionism. And so I spoke to a few different people. I spoke to protesters at the Free Palestine rally, and I spoke to Professor Gelvin, who's the head of Middle Eastern Peace Studies at UCLA. And they both kind of explained Zionism in two very different ways. She basically said Zionism is the oppression of Palestinian people. He said that Zionism is a form of Jewish nationalism. In your perspective, what is Zionism? So I think that the definition of Zionism is that Jews throughout our history, God promised us that He'll bring us back to Israel, and so the Jews throughout history have held on to that promise, and that is part of the reason why Jews were able to get up and continue, is because they knew that there was going to be a better tomorrow. And so that idea of coming back to Israel, we're talking about in the Messianic era, when Mashiach comes, that idea has kept Jews throughout history. If you see Jews going to the gas chambers during the Holocaust, they were singing a song, Ani Mamin, I believe. And it was about belief that God will take us to the promised land. So true Zionism was this idea that Jews believe that God will bring us back to Israel. And that's what kept us, and that's what it continues. As the promise of Zionism hasn't been there. We'll have a Jewish land with a temple and full peace and security around our borders, and that actually has been what keeps us able to hold ourselves high and keep ourselves proud and keep the morale of the Jewish people strong, is this concept of knowing that we'll be back, that God will bring about the Messianic era, and we'll have a time of peace with the temple in Jerusalem. That would be there might be modern terms that people use for Zionism, but that's what the real term of Zionism is like more of a biblical term in that sense.
That's really interesting. Yeah, so it's not necessarily about nationalizing, but it's more about.
Yeah, I mean, Jews don't, whether we're in Israel or not in Israel, we feel like we're a nation. We are a nation. It doesn't, so I don't, maybe the more modern term for Zionism is, creating a nation or whatever it is. But I as a rabbi, I try to go to the biblical term of it, and that's what really keeps us together as a people, is this strong belief that there'll be a time, there'll be a Messianic era where God will bring us back to Jerusalem. And there's a famous song, Ani Mamin, that I believe, and off to the gas chambers, Jews sang this song. That's what kept them going. As they were they knew where they were going. They knew they were going to the gas chambers. This is what kept them going, this idea of knowing that we'll have a time period like that.
So it's really important.
It's one of the, so there's 13 principles of Judaism. It's one of the 13 principles of Judaism.
Interesting. And there's different types of Jews, right?
So ultimately, there's one type of Jew. There's a Jew.
But there's from Seth Rogen to Williamsburg. There's a lot of different.
Yeah. So Jews have different flavors, and maybe they grew up in different areas. Mm-hmm. But a Jew is a Jew, and a Jew is a Jew. If you're born to a Jewish mother, you're as Jewish as Moses. And whether you party with Hamas or at these rallies or you don't, you're still Jewish. In fact, just this morning, a friend of mine sent me a video. He went to get his son's tooth done at a dental office, and his nurse or dental assistant was his name was it was an Arabic name, and he got a little nervous, and he's so he wanted to kind of feel the situation. He started asking him what's the story, how you feeling, what are you feeling? In the end, his dad is Palestinian, and he moved to America and married a Jewish girl, and he's a Jewish boy. Mm-hmm. And they put on tefillin, they did a mitzvah together, and so I feel like a Jew is a Jew. It doesn't make a difference doesn't make a difference what your last name is or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And yes, of course, Jews have different opinions, like everyone has different opinions.
That protest that was done at the Capitol Rotunda a couple days ago, where it was Jewish people basically storming the Capitol, demanding a ceasefire.
I think that they're totally they're totally mistaken. They're blind to what happened, or people forget so fast on what happened literally a week and a half ago. People 12 days ago or whatever it is. People literally forget so fast, and they can't. Maybe they couldn't stomach the videos or the pictures, so they didn't watch it, or they didn't. It's not like ceasefire. They literally have 200. They have 200 hostages. So they're still in the middle of hurting our people. It's not a ceasefire. Let them give back the hostages, and then we can. I don't know. People are talking as if the war is just going on for months, and literally they're still hurting our hostages. They're still sending rockets. And
Now, what do you think these hostages are experiencing under Hamas captivity?
I'm afraid to let my mind go there. I don't know. I know there's a Jewish father who found out that his son was killed, and he was so happy. He's like, at least he wasn't taken hostage. He's like, he literally found out that his son was murdered by the terrorists, and he was happy because that meant that his son wasn't taken as a hostage, to know that what they would do to him. So I mean, that's telling. I think you have to. I mean, I don't know anybody who's parading on with those rallies. I don't know if they're blind. I don't know. Are they not seeing videos? Are they not seeing footage? Are they not hearing? I don't know. I mean,